Some people live as if they are in constant mourning, not for the death of someone, but for the loss of old versions of themselves. They maintain relationships that have already expired, insist on jobs that drain their life energy, accumulate objects they haven't touched in years, and nurture old resentments as if they happened yesterday. At first glance, they seem like loyal, persistent, committed individuals. But according to Carl Jung, this appearance hides a deeper and more disturbing psychological truth. These people are not being faithful to anything other than an invisible prison built by their own minds. This inability to let go of the past is not a sign of emotional nobility. It is a symptom of a psychic blockage. Jung called this libidinal fixation. When a person's psychic energy, what should flow toward the present and the future, gets frozen in figures, situations, or objects from the past, the vital energy of the soul becomes paralyzed, unable to transform, and the individual begins to live like a psychological ghost. They no longer inhabit their current life. They merely haunt memories, places, and identities that have already died. The most alarming thing is that this is not just a poetic metaphor. It is a profound clinical diagnosis. People who cannot detach have developed, according to Jung, a pathological identification with external objects. They have not just had a relationship, they are that relationship. They have not just worked at a certain company, their identities have merged with that social role. Letting go of what is outside seems equivalent to dying inside. This type of attachment arises from an internal void that has never been filled. The person does not possess an authentic, differentiated sense of self. What they believe they are, in fact, are roles they have learned to play, functions they have learned to fulfill, masks they have learned to wear. And any threat of losing one of these identifications triggers an existential panic. Without that, who am I? Jung observed that many of these people live in a psychological state called mystical participation, a primitive fusion between the self and the world, where there is still no clear distinction between subject and object. Small children live this way, but adults who have not completed the process of individuation remain trapped in this state. They have never truly become someone. They are still emotional extensions of what they possess, what they do, whom they love or hate. And because of this, letting go of any of these things is equivalent to disappearing. Today's video is a deep dive into this invisible prison. We will explore why so many people are unable to leave the past behind, not out of weakness, but due to frozen psychic structures. We will understand why attachment is not just an emotional habit, but an unconscious defense against inner emptiness. And most importantly, we will discover with Jung how to break this cycle. Because as long as you cling to who you were, you block who you can become. Are you ready for this confrontation? There is a type of suffering that does not scream. It camouflages itself in phrases like, "I just need more time." "Maybe one day everything will go back to how it was before." Or, "I can't imagine my life without this." At first glance, it seems merely like emotional attachment. But according to Carl Jung, what lies behind this difficulty in letting go is not nostalgia or hope. It is identity fusion, a deep confusion between who you are and what you are attached to. Jung observed that when a person cannot let go of something from the past, a relationship, a job, an object, a trauma, it is often not because they value it in a healthy way, but because their identity has been built around it. The ego has expanded and absorbed the object as part of itself. The job is not just a means of livelihood. It is the definition of your worth. The relationship is not just a life story. It is the structure that supports the self. The trauma is not just an experience. It is the narrative around which the psyche has organized itself. And in this scenario, detachment does not seem like a transition. It feels like a death. This phenomenon is what Jung called ego inflation. But it is not the inflated ego of arrogance. Rather, it is an ego that has incorporated elements that do not belong to it. Social roles, temporary identities, idealized images. The problem is that by identifying with external contents, the ego loses its adaptability, becomes rigid, defensive, and above all fragile. Everything that should be transient becomes essential. Everything that should be lived and left behind becomes an emotional foundation that is impossible to remove. The origin of this fusion lies in the absence of a consolidated self. When the individual has not developed an authentic inner center, a structure of identity rooted in themselves, they seek this sense of stability in external sources. The job becomes a lifeline. The partner becomes a mirror of worth. The past becomes a refuge. And when they detach from these anchors, the person finds themselves adrift, confronted by a terrifying question: if I am no longer this, what is left of me? This fear of the dissolution of the self is what leads so many people to fiercely resist any type of change. Even in the face of evidently exhausting situations, they justify it with rational arguments. But the truth is that psychically they cannot bear the collapse of the constructed identity. They prefer stagnation to reinvention. They prefer to suffer in the known rather than risk the emptiness of the unknown, not because they are weak, but because they are fused. There is no separation between subject and object, between I and what I should let go of. This psychic fusion is more common than it seems. People who refuse to change careers even while hating what they do. Individuals who remain emotionally tied to absent partners. People who still live as if they are in a time that has already passed. All these cases share the same structure: dependence on the external to validate their own existence. And as long as the ego remains inflated by identifications that do not belong to it, any attempt at detachment will seem like a threat to its very survival. But Jung went further. He discovered that this fusion between ego and external object is merely a symptom. The root of the problem lies in an even deeper psychological state, a childhood legacy that was never overcome, a state where the self and the world are still the same thing, where there is no separation, no autonomy. And it is exactly this primitive state, this psychic prison disguised as attachment, that we will explore next. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Jung observed that many adults live psychologically as children, not in the shallow emotional sense of the term, but on a deep and structural level. These people have not completed a fundamental psychic process, the separation between the self and the world. They still function as if they are extensions of what surrounds them, of the relationships they have, the roles they occupy, the possessions they accumulate. This condition is known by Jung as mystical participation, an archaic psychological state where the individual does not yet see themselves as a separate, distinct, and autonomous entity. In early life, this state is natural. The baby does not know it is a self. It feels hunger and believes that the mother's breast is part of its body. It cries and the world responds. It is cold and the blanket appears. This magical relationship with the environment is the cradle of consciousness, but it needs to be overcome. Frustration is necessary. It is essential to discover that the world does not revolve around our desires. Only then does the ego form. Only then does individuality emerge. But when this process is interrupted by trauma, abandonment, emotional neglect, or overt protection, the ego never fully consolidates. The individual grows but remains childlike in their psychic structure. This person, now an adult, lives as if they are part of the other, not as someone separate. They do not just love, they dissolve into their partner. They do not just work, they merge with the role they occupy. They do not just remember the past, they live as if they are still there. Their identity does not exist on its own. It depends on the continuity of these external connections. Therefore, any attempt to break away generates panic. Detachment means breaking the symbiosis, and as every child knows, separating from the mother is a risk of death. Jung said that the path of individuation requires precisely the opposite: the construction of an autonomous self capable of living in relation to the world, but without confusing itself with it. A self that recognizes the other as other, that lives the present as present, that integrates the past without merging with it. But as long as the individual is trapped in mystical participation, any attempt at change will be experienced as a total loss of identity. And that is why so many people sabotage their own growth, because unconsciously they believe that evolving is dying. This state of fusion also prevents facing one of life's most transformative and feared experiences, the internal void. Because when we finally separate from what binds us, what remains? What is left when we are no longer defined by others, by memories, or by the roles we occupy? It is this silent abyss and the terror it provokes that we will confront in the next part. There is a reason why so many people desperately cling to fragments of the past. It is not just because these fragments were significant. It is because letting them go would force them to confront something even more frightening: the void that remains in their place. And this is a central point in Jung's psychology. Attachment is often not driven by love, nostalgia, or memory. It is driven by fear of existential emptiness. As long as you keep your attention fixed on the exartner, the old job, the unhealed hurt, the yellowed photo from the past. You avoid looking inward. You distract yourself from a devastating question that throbs in the depths of your psyche. If I let all this go, what is left of me? This void is not just silence. It is laden with dread because it calls into question the entire psychic structure of the person. For those who have never developed an authentic self, a sense of identity that does not depend on external validation, the void is experienced as total annihilation. There is no ground, no outline, no self, just an abyss. Jung believed that this abyss paradoxically is the starting point of true transformation. He said that it is precisely in this empty space that the real self begins to emerge. But for this to happen, one must have the courage to face what has been repressed, projected, and displaced for years. Attachment serves as emotional distraction, a defense mechanism. The pain of real loss is intense, but what truly terrifies is what it reveals: the absence of internal structure. The problem is that the more one avoids the void, the more it expands. It seeps in the form of chronic anxiety, feelings of worthlessness, depressive states, or even obsessive behaviors. The ego, not knowing how to sustain itself, clings to anything that seems familiar, even if it is destructive. Imagine someone who has ended an abusive relationship but cannot move on. It is not that they still love their partner. It is that without them, they do not know who they are. The relationship filled the space where a structured self should exist. By removing it, what emerges is a black hole that consumes everything around it. That is why so many people return to what hurts, because the known pain seems more bearable than the unknown void. Jung did not see this void as an enemy, but as fertile territory. For him, nothingness is the womb of psychological rebirth. But it is necessary to allow the old to die, and this includes the roles we play, the bonds we cultivate, the traumas we feed, and even the truths we use to protect ourselves. The void is not the death of the self. It is the collapse of the illusions that prevent the self from being born. But how to access this process? How to break through the layers of defense that surround this void and transform it into fertile ground for individuation? Jung offers us a map, a set of symbolic, reflective, and active practices that allow us to recover the psychic energy frozen in the past and redirect it to the present. In the next part, we will explore these tools in depth and discover step by step how to transform the detachment from unbearable suffering into a process of real psychic liberation. Letting go is not simply forgetting, ignoring, or pretending that something no longer matters. For Jung, letting go is a deep psychic act that requires awareness, intention, and symbolism. He did not see attachment as a moral problem or a matter of willpower, but as the result of frozen psychic energy, the libido that should be flowing into the present and future, trapped in images of the past. Releasing this energy requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands symbolic action. Jung proposed the process of individuation as the path to this type of liberation. Within it, there are specific practices that help dissolve the unconscious bonds with what traps us. The first is to recognize projections. In many cases, we are not attached to what actually existed but to the symbolic image we project onto it. For example, that relationship you can't let go of may have been in reality a projection of your animus or anima, the unconscious masculine and feminine aspects that inhabit the psyche. You were not in love with just the real person, but with the psychic energy they represented for you. The job you can't leave may be a projection of your sense of value, purpose, or belonging. The trauma you can't overcome may be carrying the projection of your deepest identity. Therefore, a proposed practice is simple but revealing. Complete the sentence: if I let go of X, I feel like I am losing. The answer will often not be the object itself, but something symbolic. My importance, my security, my sense of being loved. What you really don't want to let go of is not the past. It is the part of you that lives hidden within it. Another central method is active imagination, a technique Jung used to directly dialogue with unconscious contents. Instead of just thinking about what binds you, you write or visualize a conversation with the object of your attachment. Ask, why am I still holding on to you? What do you represent for me? What would happen if I let you go? These symbolic images speak to the soul, and when heard they begin to lose the silent control they exert over the ego. The third practice is to ritualize the letting go. Jung deeply believed in the power of rituals for the psyche. They create milestones, closures, transitions, and often this is what the mind needs. A symbolic act that represents the end of a cycle. burning a letter, burying an object, writing, and then tearing up unspoken words. These external gestures signal to the unconscious that the energy can move forward. But the process does not end with letting go. Jung warned, nature abhors a vacuum. If you simply let go without filling, the void will be taken by a new attachment, often as dysfunctional as the previous one. Therefore, the fourth step is to consciously fill the space. Ask yourself, what part of me do I need to develop now that I am no longer outsourcing this to others? If the relationship gave you validation, it's time to develop self-affirmation. If the job gave you purpose, it's time to cultivate internal purpose. If the trauma gave you a victim identity, it's time to build a new narrative where you are no longer defined by what hurt you. True letting go always requires internal reconstruction. These practices are not magical. They require repetition, presence, and courage. But they are the beginning of a deep liberation. Because as long as you continue trying to let go only on the rational plane, you will fail. Attachment is not just in memory. It is inscribed in the symbolic images that govern your psyche. Yet even with these tools, many still stall the process. And the reason lies in the hidden forces that act behind the resistance, the unconscious benefits of remaining attached. There are invisible gains in staying attached. And it is precisely this shadow of letting go, the dark and hidden side of why you still haven't released, that we will reveal in the next part. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. If you have ever tried to let go of something, a person, a past, an identity, and found yourself stuck, frozen, as if something stronger was pulling you back, know this: it is not weakness, it is shadow. Jung warned us that the unconscious is not just a repository of forgotten memories, but the home of parts of ourselves that have been rejected, denied, and buried. And among these parts, the hidden gains of remaining attached to what should have been left behind often hide. This is one of the hardest truths to face. We resist letting go because, on some deep level, it forces us to confront what we do not want to see, and even more, because there are psychic benefits unconscious but very real in staying attached. Jung called this the content of the shadow, repressed aspects of personality that sabotage our development because they bring a truth too painful to be looked at directly. You might say you want to move on, but if you remain stuck, perhaps deep down you're afraid to admit that you have lost years of your life insisting on something that never had a future, or that if you let go of that pain, you will finally have to take responsibility for your happiness with no more excuses. Or still, if you truly detach, you will have to face a raw, silent, and unbearable loneliness, which has been anesthetized by artificial bonds or repeated narratives. The truth is that many of us feed on our own pain because it serves a hidden purpose. Suffering becomes identity. Trauma turns into a shield. The past transforms into a justification for stagnation. And letting all of this go would be like saying, now it's me against myself. Now I have no more excuses. Jung taught that the shadow is not just what we hate in ourselves. It is also what we fear to be. And often what prevents us from letting go is not the love for what has passed, but the fear of what will come if we no longer have that past as protection. The ex-partner, the job, the status, the trauma, all of this may be covering something even more threatening. The raw truth that you do not know who you are when you are no longer attached to it. A brutally effective way to bring this to consciousness is to complete sentences like, if I let this go, I will have to, and observe what emerges. Admit that I was wrong, acknowledge that I am alone, give up control and trust the unknown, reinvent myself without guarantees. These are the true chains. They are not made of memories but of repressed fears. They are not in the external world but in the depths of the psyche. And as long as they are not seen, attachment will continue. No matter how much you say you want to change, your shadow will decide for you. But there is an even deeper layer. There are cases where attachment is not just defense or escape. It is a symptom of something that was broken back there in experiences of pain so deep that they froze the psyche. Situations of traumatic loss, abuse, abandonment, or death. In these cases, attachment is an expression of an unintegrated complex, and it will not be resolved with personal effort or will. It requires something more specialized therapeutic work. And that is exactly what we will talk about in the next part. When attachment is not a choice but trauma, Not all attachment is conscious resistance. Not all difficulty in letting go can be resolved with reflection techniques, active imagination, or symbolic rituals. In many cases, the root of the problem is deeper, denser, and older than it seems. What you call not being able to leave the past may actually be a symptom of unprocessed trauma. And in these cases, we are not just talking about attachment. We are talking about autonomous psychic complexes that have taken control of parts of your mind. Jung understood that trauma is not simply what happened to you. Trauma is what got frozen inside you after something broke. It is the emotional experience that could not be digested, understood, or symbolized. And when the psyche encounters something too unbearable to process, it encapsulates it in a complex and unconscious structure, loaded with emotion that begins to act autonomously within the personality. If you have experienced a sudden loss, the death of someone important, the abandonment of a parent, the breaking of essential trust, your internal system may have stopped at that moment. The timeline of your life has continued, but a part of you remained there, frozen in the moment of shock, and that is why years later you still feel that you haven't moved on. Because that part of you is still there, living the trauma as if it were happening now. In these cases, attachment is not a choice, it is imprisonment. You are not just having difficulty letting go, you are psychologically fixated on an image, a memory, a feeling that has become dominant within your psyche. This is not weakness, it is not a lack of will. It is a cry for help coming from the unconscious, and the truth is harsh but necessary. Some attachments do not dissolve on their own. They need to be integrated through deep and specialized therapy. It is essential to recognize that there are limits to what we can do alone. Traumatic complexes are resistant, defensive, and often invisible even to those who carry them. They disguise themselves as values, morals, identity. They say things like, "That's just how I am," "I have a heart that's too big," "I just can't trust." But behind these phrases, there are unspoken pains, unnamed wounds, parts of the soul that have been waiting for years to be seen, recognized, and embraced. Jung saw psychotherapy not as a place of healing in the traditional sense, but as a ritualistic space where the soul can finally speak, where the unconscious can be heard without judgment, where the shadow can be integrated, and where what was broken can finally begin to recompose. Not to return to how it was before, but to be born again, more whole, deeper, more real. If you feel that you are stuck in the past, that no matter how hard you try, you can't get out of the same place, perhaps you are not just dealing with attachment. Perhaps you are dealing with trauma. And if that is the case, seeking help is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that you are ready to stop surviving and start living. Now tell me, what do you feel is still holding you back in the past? Share in the comments. Your story may be the key that someone else needed to hear. And if this video spoke to you, keep watching the next episode. It is also a fundamental part of this journey. Don't stop here. There is more to discover. There is more of you waiting to be revealed.